Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to video lecture today. We're going to look at the issue of privacy in politics. But before that, I just want to mention I'm recording this on the morning after last night's debate. Hopefully everyone got to watch it. It was, by all accounts, everything I've seen and heard, the worst debate in United States presidential history. So if you watched it and you were somewhat shell-shocked, that you're not alone. Actually, that was the reaction I saw from a lot of the commentators on the networks last night. All I can tell you is that if this was the first presidential debate that you watched, it can really only get better from here. I don't know how it could get much worse. There's been some talk about making changes before the next debate, maybe giving the moderator the ability to control the microphones, turn them off when people's time is up, when they're talking over the other candidate. I don't know if that's going to happen because most of the rules were agreed to by both campaigns a while back, but certainly a lot of reaction, not necessarily to the content of the debate, but just to the tone of the debate. So we'll unpack that a bit as we go forward. But today and on the next couple of Wednesdays, I want to talk about some topics that are related to politics and campaigns. And I know been throwing a lot of stuff at you the last couple of weeks, and I know that because I'm the one who's dealing with everything. It's the blog posts, it's the video interviews I'm setting up, it's the debate tracking, and hopefully those tasks are spread out for all of you. I tried to set them so that nobody has a lot of things due in the same week. And so far, you're doing it well. I think we're moving along at a good pace, and what I see from everyone's reactions, either your questions to the interviewees or what you're putting on the quizzes and the forums is really great. What these next 4 weeks are designed to do is, while we're looking at the debates, to look at some other issues. And the debates is not that, the debate tracking is not really that labor intensive a project for everybody, since I split it out. Everybody just has one of the debates. So I thought these are topics that whenever I teach this class or another course I have called Media and Democracy, I always spend a week on them. So this seemed like a good way to work them into the semester while the debates are going on and we're tracking them and things like that. So as I said, today we're going to talk about reporting on the private lives of public officials. It's a topic that's of importance to me. You'll understand why when I explain that. Next, we're going to talk about the role of entertainment in politics, which we've seen a bit already. It's really been, becoming more and more influential over the years. The week of October 12th, we're going to talk about the role of negative campaigning and how everybody kind of hates negative ads, but they're an effective way to get voters. And the week of October 19th is a week I always call Chaos, Revolution, and Dissent. And I would look at the 1968 Democratic Convention and the 2000 presidential election when we didn't know who the winner was. And I'll probably, this semester and the future semesters, now have to add the 2020 election to that list of events. But just to go back to where we are, this is the week we're going to look at privacy. So let me go through a couple of slides. This is something I've done at conferences, and I do it almost every semester. So I'm very used to going through these. There's going to be a couple of readings that are going to be attached to it that will probably work into the quiz that I'll have for you tomorrow morning. So this first slide is for people who I always say never or probably are never going to appear in the same slide together. The person up in the left, upper left, with the 1970s haircut is Kevin Cronin. He was the lead singer of a band called REO Speedwagon, which was one of the top bands in the country when I was doing my music writing. Here's a more recent picture of Kevin. It looks quite different from what he did back then. But when I was speaking with him for a story about either a tour they were doing or an album, he said something very interesting that always stuck with me. And he said, when REO Speedwagon was starting out and we were a struggling band, we used to talk. We used to say, wouldn't it be great if we hit it big and we made a ton of money and we got to be really famous, and we were so famous that we couldn't even walk down the street without people stopping us and mobbing us. And he said, you know what happened? We did hit it big. We did make a ton of money. And we did get to be so famous that we couldn't walk down the street. And you know what? That part of it wasn't so good. So, with fame, with success comes some compromises. You give up some of your privacy. Next to him is the late Senator Ted Kennedy. And you guys probably don't know it. It's one of those things that have gone away. It's probably good that it's gone away. But there used to be a whole series of jokes about the Kennedy family. The Kennedy family has undergone tremendous tragedies, different, members of the family. And these jokes were extremely distasteful, but they circulated a lot. And when I was working in the governor's office, we hired a speechwriter who had previously worked for Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who was the lieutenant governor of Maryland. She was a daughter of Senator Bobby Kennedy. And he said, I always heard these Kennedy jokes, but when you talk with somebody and you realize they're about somebody's uncle, they're about somebody's father, you feel a lot differently about them. So that really stuck with me. Then I'm going to go down to bottom right-hand corner. That's former Vice President Dick Cheney. While Dick Cheney was in office, he went on a hunting trip, and he actually shot accidentally one of the people on the trip with him in the face. Fortunately, it wasn't a fatal injury. I don't know how you can get shot in the face and not be seriously injured, but it happened. He didn't tell anybody. He probably told people in the administration, but he didn't tell the press. And the White House press corps was pretty upset about that. The Vice President of the United States shoots someone in the face, and they're not told about it. And his argument was, I did it on my day off. I was on private property. I was with private citizens. It's none of your business. And he had somewhat of an argument there. But on the other hand, he's, a heartbeat away from the president. And he's someone who, shot somebody in the face. The journalist said, you do have a right to know. And that kind of underscores a lot of what we're going to talk about in writing about the private lives of public officials. It's a gray area. Sometimes it's just sensationalism. There's no reason to write about it. Other times there's a legitimate news value to it. So and you can look at. I'm going to give you some different case studies, and you can weigh the pros and cons. Okay, down in the left corner, that's Jim McGreevey, who is the governor I work for. His name has come up in some of the video interviews we've done, and probably other things I've done in class. I knew Jim for a long time before he was governor. I worked for him in Woodbridge. I covered him when I was a reporter. And about 2 years into his term, and he had been married twice, had a daughter with each of his wives. One August day, he shocked everybody and announced that he was gay, and he was resigning from office. And it was a huge, big international story. And I remember, to me, it was kind of more of a personal story. It was, my friend going through a really troubling time, having to deal with coming out in a very public setting. But it wasn't treated that way in the press, and it was kind of a tough thing for him to go through, somewhat tough for me personally, too. Fortunately, everybody's landed on his feet, but it kind of gave me a sense of what happens, maybe what Kevin Cronin was talking about, what the speechwriter was talking about with the Kennedys, that here's someone who you knew as a friend, and all of a sudden his sex life is being discussed on CNN. And this was 2004, and things have kind of spiraled in, probably not the best of directions since then. Fortunately, we've all kind of landed on our feet. People from the McGreevey administration are doing well. He's doing a lot of work with prisoner reentry programs in New Jersey. I got to spend some time with him in February before the pandemic hit. So, it's one of those things. You go through difficult times, but as I said, everyone has landed on their feet. So as far as privacy goes, when I started looking into this issue, I read a lot of things, and the best definition I found was in this book written by Ellen Alderman and Carolyn Kennedy. Carolyn Kennedy was the daughter of Senator John F. Kennedy. And she said, the right to privacy, it seems, is what makes us civilized. And I thought that's really a good way of describing what privacy is, because it's not a right. A lot of times people say, oh, I have a right to privacy. It's in the Constitution. It's not. There's case law that defines privacy, but basically it's, what keeps us civilized. And maybe it's why so much of today's political discourse is uncivilized, because privacy has, gone to the side. Okay. I want to talk about the role the press has had in writing about the private lives of public officials. This is a book by Larry Sabato, he lives at the University of Virginia. He's a political commentator. He wrote this a number of years ago. He's still very active. I saw him just last night, tweeting about the debate. But here's a chapter in here, which I sometimes assign for reading. I think I may not assign it this time because we have a lot of other things on our plate, but I'll just summarize it. We went through the steps of how the press progressed in terms of writing about the private lives of public officials. And he used these kind of canine references. He said from 1941 through 1966, he called it lapdog journalism, which meant basically the press, and he's talking specifically about the White House press corps, would write whatever was given to them. If something was happening that with someone's personal life, it was off limits. And we now know that, John F. Kennedy had a number of affairs while he was in office. They never wrote about that, but they probably knew about it. And he gives 3 or 4 other examples, in the book about other presidents where it was kind of an old boys club. That sort of thing happened. There was an unwritten rule. They didn't write about it. They just wrote about what was happening in office. Then he talks about a period called watchdog journalism, 1966 to 1974, where the press began to get more skeptical of what they were hearing from the White House. Part of it had to do with the Vietnam War. Early on, the press was told that we were just there in an advisory role. Clearly, we were not. And then Watergate came around, where the Watergate scandal led to Richard Nixon's resignation. So the press became more aggressive during that watchdog journalism period. And after that, he said it became something called junkyard journalism, where the press was even more aggressive. They wouldn't, not only were they skeptical of what they heard, but they would be proactively go out and do investigations, try to find out what was going on. And we would probably move past that junkyard journalism stage. But I wanted you to see the progression that what we see today from the media wasn't always that way. And his arguments pro and con. Some people say we don't need to know about the personal lives of, the presidents. If he had an affair, what does it have to do with the way he governs? Other people say that it does. And sometimes, you can make the argument that, there's some sort of influence there that's going to affect the way someone governs. That's one of the examples I'm going to give you at the end of this lecture. So this is something that happened gradually, but there's some benchmarks along the way where the press made steps that kind of moved them from point A to point B in terms of writing about politicians or even public figures' personal lives. This is a man named Gary Hart. He was a U.S. Senator from Colorado. He was considered a front runner for the presidential nomination in 1988. He was kind of in the John F. Kennedy mold. You can see him, there. He was popular. He was leading in the polls and in some of the early debates. And there had been some questions raised about him that he wasn't particularly authentic. His name was Hart Pence. He changed it to Hart to sound, more Anglo. He shaved a couple of years off his age in his resume, and that was a lot easier to do in 1988 when we didn't have the internet. And there are always rumors that he was having affairs. And this was 1988, and the press said, so he's having affairs. It's not a story. We should write about him as a presidential candidate. And he kept getting asked about them. And he finally challenged the press. This is what he said. He said, follow me around. I don't care. If anyone wants to put a tail on me, go ahead. He'd be very bored. And he said this, not thinking the press would take him up on his challenge. And unfortunately for Gary Hart, the press did. This is a picture of him with a woman named Donna Rice, who was not his wife. The press stalked out his apartment in Washington, or his townhouse in Washington. They saw her going into the apartment at night, not leaving, and there was a big debate. It was the Miami Herald as to whether or not this was news. I mean, I think today if it happened, it would be news, or people, might not even care. But back then, among the journalists at the Miami Herald, there was one school, people said, we don't need to write about this. Gary Hart's a presidential candidate. What he does when he's not on the campaign trails, not anyone's business, has nothing to do with how good a president he's going to be. And then other people said, well, we should write about this. It's about character. And you tie it in with those things about changing his name, changing his age, and, maybe he's not the person we think he's going to be. So story came out. Miami Herald published it. They actually got a lot of criticism from other media, from the public. But the story ran, and other outlets picked up on it. Bottom line is it drove Gary Hart out of the presidential race and pretty much out of politics. So he's somebody who might have been the next United States president. There's a film that I showed in my class last semester about him. It's called The Front Runner, and I think I'm going to just put the trailer on Moodle. It'll give you a sense of that. But Gary Hart's response was, as I said, he didn't expect the press to take him up on the challenge because he thought the press should be looking at more important things. He felt blindsided. He said, you shouldn't be looking at me. You should be looking at the counterinsurgency. You should be looking at the military-industrial complex, corruption. Those are the things you should be writing about. And, he had a point there. Those things are important, but they didn't get written about. Think about 1988 and what the Miami Herald's decision meant for the press going forward. So this is another case. It's not a politician, but it kind of shows that gray area of when you should write about someone's personal life. This is Arthur Ashe. He was a United States tennis star. He contracted AIDS around the time the AIDS epidemic was starting. And at that time, most people who had AIDS got it because through sexual contact, and they got it through using dirty hypodermic needles. There was drug addicts were using it. So there wasn't a lot of sympathy for people with AIDS, and not a lot of government support for AIDS research. But you could also get it through blood transfusions. That's how Arthur Ashe contracted AIDS. So he was kind of a different, he didn't fit the picture of what most people thought AIDS victims were. He knew he was dying. He wanted to die in privacy with his family. He told his family, that back then, unfortunately, AIDS was a death sentence. A sports writer found out that he had AIDS and he was dying and was going to do a story about it. And, the Ashe family asked him not to do it, and the sports writer felt it was a legitimate story. Here's one of the top tennis players of our generation. He's dying. He said, I would have written the story whether he was dying of cancer or of AIDS. And eventually, when the Ashe family found out the story was going to be out, written one way or another, they kind of beat him to the punch at the press conference. They announced what was happening. Ashe did die, but his story got out and it was shared with the world. And the argument that the sports writer made in support of what he did was that this put a new picture on the face of AIDS in the country. You see, it's kind of a long quote here, but it says his greatest legacy might have been the dignity displayed as he was dying and his ability to convince people that it was a public health issue. Force powerful people, including the president, to look at the disease a different way, as something other than a gay plague. And you have to wonder, if this hadn't happened, would we have had all the money for AIDS research that followed that? So as I said, there's a gray area. Certainly, the man wanted to die in privacy with his family. That didn't happen. But maybe because the world found out about it, millions and millions of dollars eventually were allocated for AIDS research, and AIDS is no longer the death sentence that it was back then. One final example I'm going to give you from my days in New Jersey, and I think it kind of shows you how, this issue kind of goes back and forth. Man on the right is Jon Corzine. He was a United States Senator from New Jersey, later the governor. The woman on the left is Carla Katz. She was the head of a labor union representing most of New Jersey's state workers. They dated for a while. There wasn't a conflict because he was in the Senate, which was a federal office. She was dealing with state issues. But then Jon Corzine decided to run for governor. So that raised some eyebrows. They said, if he's governor and he's representing the administration in negotiations with state workers on contracts, and his girlfriend is head of that union, what are they going to bring to the table? Is that going to affect the way the negotiations go one way or the other? But they actually broke up before he became governor. This is kind of a sequence of what happened. They dated while he was a United States Senator. Her union represented 10,000 state workers. They broke up before he ran for governor. So in many ways, that could have ended the conflict. They don't have any relationship. If he was elected as he was, he's not gonna, she's no longer his girlfriend. So they don't have a personal relationship when those negotiations take place. But what happened was, during the campaign, story broke that while they were dating, Carla Katz needed money to buy a house. So he lent her the money, $470,000. And then he told her, don't bother to pay me back. Now that probably seems unfathomable, but Jon Corzine was a multimillionaire. When he was worked for Goldman Sachs before he got into politics, I remember when he was thinking about running for the U.S. Senate, he came to Woodbridge Town Hall where I worked, and Jim McGreevey then, was one of the people that he spoke with about what it would be like to run for office. They briefed him on, what it's like being a candidate, deal with the media, outreach. And at the end of the conversation, it said, "Oh, and you're going to have to raise probably about $17 million." And he said, "Oh, I'll just write a check for it." And he did. He actually wrote checks for much more than that to finance the Senate campaign, the governor's campaign. So when he said, "Don't pay me back the $470,000," it's something, it's a large sum of money. It's nearly $500,000, but to him, it wasn't. So the reason that was significant is, they don't have a personal relationship anymore. But when they go to the bargaining table, and it's not him sitting at the bargaining table, but he makes the final calls, how tough is she going to bargain for the state workers she represents when she has a $500,000 gift from the administration or someone, the head of the administration? And it actually got to be more of an issue. After he became governor, more stories broke, and it wasn't just $470,000. He'd given her more than $6 million. He paid for her law school, bought a condo, all kinds of things. So, there was a situation where he had given her large sums of money. She's representing state workers, and if I'm a state worker, I have to wonder, how hard is this person going to bargain for me when she's, already gotten billions of dollars from the people she's bargaining with? So what the press wanted to do was see what sort of email exchanges they had. Were there any arrangements made, where, they were going to bargain one way or another? And they wanted to look not just at the governor's account, which is a public record, but at his private accounts. He may have had a Yahoo account or a Gmail or something like that. So it was an argument back and forth in the courts whether or not those conversations were private or whether the public had a legitimate interest in seeing what they talked about. So this is kind of what I just said. The critics said they had the potential to influence contract negotiations. So after the contract was signed, Corzine's a Democrat, so the Republican State Committee filed a suit looking for all those emails. And then, actually a couple of news organizations joined that lawsuit as well. It went back and forth in the courts. There's the news organizations joined. Superior Court level, which is the first level in New Jersey courts, they said the emails should be made public. The public has an interest to see them. So Corzine appealed. Appellate court overturned it, said the emails should be private. Got appealed again, went to the highest court in New Jersey, the Supreme Court. Supreme Court agreed with the appellate court. They said keep the emails private. So what happened was the emails got leaked, and they became the Star Ledger, the largest newspaper in the state, got copies of the emails, and they published them. So even though the court said these things should be private, the press somehow found out about them, and that's kind of just bringing it into modern terms. The president didn't want his tax returns public. The press found out about them. The press is going to be aggressive. They're going to find things when, if they think they're in the public interest, they're going to write about them. I used to talk about when Sarah Palin became the vice presidential nominee, and at the time her daughter was pregnant, and she was asked about it. She said it's a private issue. We're not going to talk about it. And within hours, the press knew who the father of the baby was and had gone to the high school where she was to talk with them. So some of those things, do cross the lines, but it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that the concept of privacy more or less has disappeared. And I did a lot of my work on this, maybe 10 years ago or longer. But I think if we look at the way things are today with social media, with how aggressive the press is, it's really tough to keep things private. Even the president of the United States could not keep his tax returns private. So what I used to do when we discuss this in class, and it's something I want you to think about, and I may work it in the quiz or a forum, was, what do you think? Do you think the emails should have been made public? And you think the press made too much of the story? Because my impression was, once the Star Ledger got the emails and they published them, it wasn't a big deal. There wasn't anything in there that was particularly alarming. They were like normal emails between two people. There wasn't one that said, "Oh, you gave me this, you gave me $1 million, so I'll relent on this one request we have for the contract." There really was hardly anything about the contract, but I think they tried so hard to get these emails. When they finally got them, they felt like, hey, we have to publish it. So that's, as I said, my lecture on privacy. think about it going forward. I always tell people from my personal experience, when you look at these public figures and when you talk about them, remember that they're just like us in many ways. You know, they have families, their feelings get hurt, even though they have tough skins. But at the end of the day, they come home, they're with their wife, and kids, or partners, whoever, and they deal with a lot of the same things we do. So when they're criticized, it's a person that's criticized, and not to say that the criticism isn't valid, but I always think it's kind of important to keep that in mind. So that's, let me just stop sharing the screen here. Uh, as I said, that's kind of the rundown on how privacy fits into all this. I'm going to give you a couple of things to read about that, which will probably be on quiz, which I'm going to post, as I said, by tomorrow, Thursday morning. And with that, we'll be in touch. This is going to be, I haven't done the Moodle page yet, but there'll be a number of things on Moodle too. As always, I'll have them kind of explained for you one by one. So everybody, have a good day. We'll be back in touch. If not before Monday, if not on Monday before then. So if I don't talk to you, have